5 areas. The first one, which I think comes out really strongly in Da Nang, is that the bottom line is, none of this is going to work if you don't have communities engaged in understanding and seeing the case for themselves. Because actually the people who are making the greatest investment often are the poor in upgrading their housing, in bringing in new technologies. In the case of Da Nang, which is I'm familiar with the example that Phong spoke to, it was individual households that took the risk by taking, yes, a soft loan, but a loan nonetheless, and a fairly large loan for a low-income household. In some cases, I think $2,500, $3,000 in some case for a household, administered by the Women's Union on very soft terms, but still a lot of money. So for households to see the importance of putting that kind of, taking on that kind of debt in order to improve and protect their livelihoods, their assets, their lives, and their human health, that sort of engagement with households, with communities, to actually socialize and sort of increase the awareness of the sort of opportunities and the risks associated with these kinds of investments is really important. There was, particularly with the first couple stuff, really important points around the role of the industry at large, the housing industry, the construction industry. If you do a pilot of 250 households, is that going to transform the capacity and awareness of design standards and low-cost, resilient housing knowledge within all of the artisans and construction and builders, etc., in that city or in that country? And how do you accelerate that so that it becomes more of a norm, especially where it's a no-regrets design, where the incremental cost is either negligible or zero, or indeed, in one case, I think, even lower cost, in the case of Gorakhpur, to introduce some of like the Jali technology, etc., because you're reducing the total amount of building material required. The third was obviously around the piece that I mentioned already, which is the forward financing. I mean, to get those those benefits realized in the cost benefit, we need more mechanisms that are going to make the costs upfront available and affordable at scale for more and more households. And then, of course, there's all of the stuff that wraps around all that, which is lots of references to policies, standards, collective solutions. The cooling station is not just something that's going to be an individual shelter solution, but something that is actually for an area within an urban context. Things that are already happening are not insignificant. Again, I come back to the Nari story and the idea that even 250 households that were part of a pilot, for those houses to be standing and relatively unscarred as a result of a typhoon, while several hundred or thousands, as I understand around that, faced more damage, that's a really important signal as to what can be done. But again, that was for 250 households, and if you take all of the coastal cities up and down Vietnam, there are tens or hundreds of thousands of households that need to go through that kind of process. And what do we need to do to galvanize and get that scale of activity going? Couple of questions I was left with, which maybe we'll come to in the Q&A. I didn't quite get a sense of the cost-benefit analysis and how it varied when it was retrofits versus new, and maybe that's just something I missed. I don't know if that came out in each of the cases. I'm thinking again about the Da Nang, which is very much a retrofit, versus future construction, and is there a way that we need to separate those two out as part of the policy messaging that we give, as well as the financing? What do we do about households that are already in houses that are not resilient, and is the economics of trying to make that house a lot different from building a new house? And I presume, again, that depends on what kind of risk you're talking about, whether it's more to do with heat or storms. And I guess the other was some of what you were talking about was, while the cost effectiveness may not be necessarily feasible for an individual household right now, there is actually a wider economic benefit than just to the household, because there's lost productivity. You talk about person days lost. You talk about, the whole heat issue in particular. But it's the same with damages at the time of a typhoon or a flood. There is a broader economic case for this, but it's more in the sort of public domain. It's not an individual cost borne by any one household. How do we bring the costs of that into the cost-benefit analysis, which I guess gets us into the damage and loss sort of domain, and what are the kind of connections between those two. So those were just some thoughts I was having while listening to these really, really interesting presentations. So I want to just thank all four of you again for getting us sort of thinking about these issues. I was asked to sort of kick off with a couple of questions and then open it up to the audience to take the opportunity to talk to the four panelists. So I had a couple, maybe, which I'll start with. First one for you, Phong. So as I already sort of mentioned, sort of cost up front is quite high for an individual household to take on board the loan to do the storm-resistant and flood-resistant housing upgrade. So how difficult was it in actually getting 250 households to take the loan? Were you in a situation where there was a huge unmet demand, or was it actually quite hard to communicate and build the case for those first 250 even? So to get a sense of how big a burden was it, and how much of a how much convincing, I guess, or socializing needed to be done in order to see households willing to take on this level of debt in order to address that. And then maybe for Fawad, coming back to the point about forward financing, I'm just curious what your take is on the wider economic costs. If you take the heat issue in particular and productivity questions, how does the analysis that you've been doing, how can that be sort of extrapolated to broader, say, citywide economic costs and benefits, and is that something that you think will emerge out of this research? So I'll stop with those two questions to Phong and Fawad, and then we'll open it up to the others.
Yeah, Astrid. The question is for the process of building housing, climate resilient housing in Da Nang. So since we implement this housing, there's kind of high unmet demands in there. There are several factors in this, because recently the typhoons and floods hit Da Nang quite hard, and the people experience the damages of their house. And the housing resilient, before Asian program, we work with women union. There are some other program in Da Nang and in central part of Vietnam, and the people see the benefits, particularly after the typhoon. For those who do the retrofitting or who build the new house with the typhoon resistant technique, their roof and their house is not damaged. So that is very important. The second one is the communication on the climate change. Recently is quite intense in Vietnam, because in Vietnam is normally in the typhoon and flood season a lot of damages, and on the disaster in Vietnam is on climate related. It's different from other countries, have some kind of geology, but in Vietnam on the climate related disaster, flood, typhoon, drought. That is very important. Another important point is Vietnam and the people, they very value the house. The house is not just the house is the home. So they invest on their saving in the house for their education, for their children, for their lives, and comfortable for their livelihoods. And also they are important for the people who live in the city, because if they don't invest in the city, normally the poor and near poor, they live in very, very vulnerable house, and after the typhoon and after the floods, if their house is damaged, it takes 10 days or 2 weeks to repair, and that it affects their livelihood. So if they invest in their house, they feel more secure, and they can recover quickly from the typhoon. That is very important. So that's why when we work with women unions, it's very, very highly interest from the local people as well as from the local government. After the typhoon Nari, so more people approach the women union to ask for the loan. This is not the grant, this is the loan. And 1 year is about 7.8% interest rate. But people, they want to buy this. What is the key factor over here? Because in this program, we provide free advise on the typhoon construction technique and advise the local engineering team and women union. They provide advice for loans and micro schemes so that the people, they can manage their incomes and manage their scheme for repayment so that not impact to their livelihood, because they invest to the home is not income generation for the home. So that is those kind of message, and not just the economic return, other social and also the status of the home. But when they build a strong house, their status in the family and neighborhood is also increasing. So that is the key factor. That's why now in Da Nang, high demand in the housing. Related to the other question you asked about the retrofitting, what is the cost benefit about this? So we did the qualitative analysis around this, because in the quantitative it's quite challenging. Because the many kind of retrofitting component inside the house in Da Nang. So we organize a series of share learning and dialogue with the local people, the poor and the local builder, to conduct the cost benefit, but in terms of qualitative, about the sustainability of the housing, about the social economic, and also about the functionality and utility of the build a new house and also retrofit the house. Most of the people, they go for the option of build a new house, but why in Da Nang? You can see many families, they still borrow the loan for retrofitting because of financial constraint. Even the cost benefits analysis, we have scoring. We have some scoring for the quality quite lower than the new building, but that people have to go for the option because of the financial accessibility limitation. Thank you.
Yeah, Ashwin, I think your question is very important. I think the heat issue and a lot of other issues don't get, analyzed because of some of difficulties with doing a macro analysis and coming down. You realize that, most of South Asia, there's no way to measure it, but the informal economy may be larger than the formal economy. And in case of the people that we were doing research with, it's definitely the case. So it gets very hard to actually put a macro number on it unless we start from the bottom up. And that has its own issues because, first of all, it takes a lot of work. What we were looking at this moment was the incentives to the household to, get galvanized or to start working on this. The problem with heat was that it has not reached that level yet that people will actually start doing active investment, as is in the case of floods, and floods much more than typhoon these days. But what it does allow us is to measure the incentives also at a macro level as we add these things up. What I didn't have in here was a lot of people have salaries. And they don't, if they're sick, they get days off, and that was not calculated because we're looking at incentives to the household. About half of these people are actually, the burden is going either to the government or private sector. Right. And this is the private sector that is, it's Pepsi. One of the colonies was, most of the workers are in Pepsi, which does maximum 80-90% of their production in these 3 months of summer. The rest of the year is an easy year. Now, there are big incentives around that at that area level to provide these cooling centers or provide certain measures so that they can make the profits that they have been used to making. So, and what they've done already is that they've started providing clean drinking water because too many people were getting sick, and they were losing a lot of productivity in that way. So there's that, and then there's also the burden on the public system, which is already very weak in health. So this can be turned around, and first of all, to look at the scale of this, and secondly, at different levels, to look at what is the burden that is shared by the formal sector, by the private sector, and what kind of incentives would there be to get them to start working on this, and especially when you have the knowledge that this is going to happen. And the temperature is the most certain projections in any of the climate science. The typhoons are almost impossible to guess, but temperature, we know that we can do our numbers.
Thank you. So I think now is the moment to open it up and invite questions from the audience. I think we have a mic at the back, so if you want to just walk to the back and just give us your name and direct your question, if it's to everyone or if it's to a particular individual on the panel, then please state that. I think we also have some mics going to be floating around. Is that right? There we go.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Perry. I'm coming from University of Oxford, and I'm very interested in the work that's happening here. I wanted to ask a follow-up question to everybody, including Ashvin, about the exploration of funding mechanisms that might be viable and learning from some of the kind of the mega or macro funding mechanisms that have been working directly P2P to local community groups. Has there been an exploration of something that's sort of Kiva-like or Zafen, which is something that I worked on in Haiti, where you have global access to microloans, both for businesses that might be developing like drinking water, retrofitting, construction, that could then also be having some micro-lending opportunities to communities, to families, to shared buildings and that kind of thing. Has there been an exploration of that kind of an idea?
Let me first see if anyone on the panel wants to respond. Marcus?
I would just jump in and say that in this project, our first thing was to say, where are there solutions that seemed reasonable? Did they make sense economically? Where did we not have solutions? And I think in the case of the temperature, there's really one of the reasons you're not seeing a lot happening is because it's really a step function. Either you can afford access to air conditioning, or you can do minor things that reduce your peak daily temperature, but you're having a hard time doing anything about it, your minimum temperatures. So the point of this was first demonstration and looking at it. It was with the knowledge that there are new funding mechanisms coming on, different lines of them, and that the argument was central in it, but it wasn't an exploration into specific funding mechanisms.
I don't have too much more to add. I just say a couple of things. One is, as far as sort of Kiva-like P2P sort of mechanisms, I'm not aware of anything that's specifically framed around sort of resilience and resilience shelter or anything like that. That said, I don't see why that couldn't be done. I would say, though, that there is more and more work being done on how certain types of economic or business opportunities, if you like, might come out of this. If you like, how can microinsurance be targeted more effectively, or how do certain types of health products how can they be made more available at a community level, or systems for management of water, whether they are sort of community systems, etc. So there's more and more of that sort of innovation happening with this sort of business mindset, and so financing coming for that. There's also a lot more discussion around how the flows of the big official funds can actually hit and get to local communities. The CBA 8 in Kathmandu later this month, and the theme is on adaptation financing at the local level. So I think both within the public finance spheres as well as some of the more business-led solutions, I think there's big unresolved questions. And I think the biggest challenges are still with government and national financing, and the recognition that the economic case is so strong. Yet, as we've struggled with this for decades with DRR. How do you incentivize high degrees of upfront investment in something that is going to save you money down the road? And just, again, this question of aligning incentives around that has just not been cracked as yet. So I don't have a very good answer for that, I'm afraid. But other questions for our panelists? I see a hand go up at the back there, and then Anna.
Thank you. My name is Kanin Hutanwat from King Mongkut Institute of Technology, Lagerbang, Thailand. I really thanks for all presentations. I think it's really insightful and eye-opening. And I have comments and questions. I think probably direct to Dr. Singh and Dr. Trump, but also very open to other speakers if you'd like to contribute to this. The first point, I think, the point of awareness of climate change and need for adaptation and resilience is really important and critical. And in my opinion, using design competition is really smart strategy. Because my hypothesis is that it can also not only just to come up with good innovation, but also can create the sense of awareness as well. So I think we can learn a lot from you that if you could share with that about the process of the design competition. For example, who get involved with this process, if the community did or not, like how do they involve, and what would be the experience of the designers themselves, that they have to balance the resilience thinking with other design considerations, such as our consideration for other factor for sustainable designs, or considerations for behavior and cultural thinking. And this is one of my questions. And the second thing is, I think you can share with us about the experience of bringing people in, or the incentives, especially in the sense of the differences between the house and the home. In Thailand, I have found that in some of the field work that people who live in the city, they live in a kind of informal and temporary conditions, in the way that their house right now, it doesn't really serve as their home. It's just the place they live to just making money. So the way they live there, they just try to minimize their investment on their houses. And I think this is quite a challenge to bring them to invest in terms of building their resilience to their house. So I wonder if you have encountered these kind of cases, and if you do, how did you what are the kind of incentives for them to taking in this kind of concept? Really appreciate that.
So both excellent questions. Maybe just to focus the panel on the first one first, which is what examples from the use of design competitions did you surface of sort of where that process sort of led to more awareness generation? Who was responding to these competitions? Did you surface a kind of a community of interested designers from particular universities? How did that process? Can you just give us an example of one or two illustrations of how that did sort of raise awareness amongst professional communities on this? And then we'll come to the second question, which is an equally good one.
Yeah, the purpose of housing resilient design competition is also, as you mentioned, is the way to raise awareness among the housing sector and climate change. Because normally we work a lot to produce climate change information or some flood risk or some typhoon risk and vulnerability assessment as some local entity, but kind of reactive access to those kind of information. So for the design competitions, we create a platform so that people more proactive access to those information for the input of the design, because this one of the criteria should be typhoon and flood resistant in their hometown. For the people who engage in this one, because we have the good opportunity in Da Nang, because we have the current climate resilient housing loan and program for the poor and near poor people implemented in Da Nang. And in Da Nang, for the last 10 years, several typhoon and flood occur, and the people at the local community and the governments really interested in the housing issue. How we can design the housing that can adapt to the local condition. And this one, we work with the local Department of Construction, private sector, because the private sector in Da Nang, they also help the housing program in Da Nang, and we work with the local university, architecture university. And this one, we had the create a very good opportunity for the student, young professional, to engage in this kind of discourse, knowing the housing resilience, knowing the climate change. And we often assume that the engineer, they know a lot of climate change, but actually very, very limited. When we have the series of share, learning, and dialogue, bring the people from the climate, bring the people from the flood and storm control, bring the people from engineering perspective, sit in the room and discuss. And we found that a lot of gap among the different stakeholders. So this kind of process is very, very useful for address the complex issue, the urban development, housing, and climate change. And we share the funding with the Women Union Program, and people who beneficiary in the housing program, they apply those kind of design, and we get the first prize to use as the communication tool and information for the housing program. So several ways to do that. That is, I think the idea of getting the people interested in the climate and housing through the competition is kind of innovative way that we apply in Da Nang.
I'm just going to ask Vijay, sorry, Fawad, you were going to say
I was just going to add something to this. So when this competition happened, we talked to the top 4 or 5 shortlisted groups that had come in. And there were groups of people, and there was a young architect, a recent graduate, I think. And we were just chatting with him. We asked him, why was he here and why was he so interested? And he told us that a few years back, his father had died from the roof being lifted up by a typhoon, and then was when he decided that he'll become an architect and design safe shelters. And he did make it to the finalists. I mean, he was not the winner, but he was in the finalists. So, just to reinforce what Fong is saying, that people have lived with this hazard so closely that there's a lot of incentives. So.
Vijay, I'm just wondering, do you want to add anything from Gorakhpur was also a competition, is that correct? How did that process go, and did it surface new relationships or institutions getting involved that you previously were not, working with?
Yes, in Gorakhpur also the design which I have shown in my slide that was not made by outsider, but the information we have collected and we have given to the disseminated in the website, and that we have the need of this. We have to first of all we have tried to get the need of the peoples, and then we have disseminated and the designs which were shortlisted was according to the need of the Gorakhpur, and we have also shared these designs with in the stakeholders meeting also. But in the Gorakhpur, at the lower level, there is a lack of knowledge about the resilient designs. But as I have told in my presentation, that local levels, peoples are also making their own way of the resilient designs, which are also very cost effective. So yes, there is a need to make more awareness about the resilient designs, and definitely there will be in future there will be more acceptability.
Marcus.
I think, if you look at the program as a whole, there was a very intentional selection of the design competition as part of a change model. One of the points of view was so much of response about climate change is these talks at high levels.